All right, gang. First of all, thanks for coming to the Excerpt channel and checking out this excerpt, clip, if you will, of an ASP podcast episode from the recent past. So you know it's not a whole episode. Whole episodes are available only on the app in the video form. You can listen anywhere you want, any podcast outlet. Listen to the audio version, not a problem. For the video version, if you want to watch the whole thing, get the app. It is literally free to watch on the app. No payment, no subscription required. Go over there, check it out, and I hope you enjoy the clip. Well, alrighty, gang. Welcome back to the Gutowski Files, starring our very own Stephen Gutowski. Stephen is the owner and founder and editor-in-chief over at The Reload.
This is not a paid endorsement, but Cigars Daily is a friend of Active Self-Protection, and like Active Self-Protection, they are active in the fight against human trafficking all over the world. If you like cigars, check out their excellent YouTube channel and pick up some sticks to support the work they do.
.com, also the host of the Weekly Reload podcast. I know I'm blindsiding you here. We didn't talk about this on our pre-brief. Do you want to talk about who was on your show this week? Can you remember who was on your show this week, Stephen?
I actually do. It is funny that you didn't warn me, though, because we spent like an hour talking about football and
yes,
whatever else. It's Jeff Asher, though. He's a crime data analyst, and so I brought him on the show because the murder rate has really taken a nosedive over the last couple of years here. And so we wanted to go through the data, and there've been, people have been raising questions, some of them legitimate, some of them not, about the validity of crime data. So I wanted to bring on an expert who deals in that directly and ask him those questions and whether we can be confident in the numbers we're seeing. And if so, what do those numbers look like? So that we spent, it was a little bit shorter too. So it's a pretty brisk listen, this one. I think people will come away better informed if they go and check it out.
You heard it here first, folks. So go over to thereload.com and check that out, and consider getting a membership. Stephen does rely on his membership dues to fund his important work, so go check that out. So this week we are talking about an article over at The Reload written by our very own Stephen Gutowski entitled "SCOTUS Agrees to Hear Smith & Wesson Fight with Mexico." So what this is essentially is that Mexico is suing, the government of Mexico is suing American firearms manufacturer, Smith & Wesson being maybe the most popular or biggest among them, in U.S. federal court, Stephen?
Yes, that's right. In U.S. federal court. That's why the Supreme Court is getting involved here. Actually, because Smith & Wesson has asked the court to take up this case because a lower court just found, as a panel in the Third Circuit, which is like Northeast, they found that they basically gave the Mexico suit a go-ahead, a green light. You can sue. This doesn't violate what's called the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, which was created as a liability shield for the gun industry from really suits like this one that try to essentially hold gun businesses accountable for the criminal acts of third parties. In this case, the criminal acts of third parties in other countries, in Mexico, specifically cartels and gang violence that happens down there with American-made firearms is what's at the center of this case. But the lower court found there was this case fit into one of the exceptions. It's something where the panel said, it was foreseeable that some guns made by Smith & Wesson and other American makers would end up being used by cartels in crimes in Mexico, and that Mexico would have to foot the bill for the harms involved in those crimes. So that was enough justification for the lower court. Smith & Wesson appealed that decision to the Supreme Court saying, we think you should get involved, and we believe this goes against the precedents that you've set in other cases around really more that question, this sort of liability question, not even necessarily specific to the PLCAA or the firearms industry, but in other contexts, the Supreme Court has looked at similar questions in similar cases. And that's what they appealed on. And that's what the Supreme Court has now accepted and what they're going to hear this case on. Little less to do with the Second Amendment, though Smith & Wesson does bring up the Second Amendment as a defense in this case or as part of the case. But I think it's probably going to focus much more on sort of the proving the causality, proving that Smith & Wesson's actions were closely related enough to the actual harms at issue here for there to be a viable legal claim. So that's what I expect the case to actually focus on. But it does have obvious Second Amendment
Implications too.
implications. Yeah, for sure.
So I guess my question is the government of Mexico alleging that Smith and Wesson et al., including all these other companies that are named in the suit, that they're sort of actively aware of the fact or of the mechanism of how the guns are getting from the U.S. to Mexico? They know, okay, there's certain dealers that are obviously at fault, and they failed to sort of remedy that. Does that make any sense? It's kind of a poorly worded question. I think you get the idea.
That is sort of what their argument is getting at, but in a very general sense, not in a specific sense. Because, and what I think you're asking here, right, is do they have some sort of evidence that Smith and Wesson knowingly has sold guns to the cartels? And
Right.
no, they don't. They don't have anything like that. They're basically arguing that there's certain dealers whose guns sold through these dealers end up in being recovered at crime scenes in Mexico more often than other dealers, which is is sort of the bad apple gun dealer argument that's been around for a long time in gun control circles, that there's certain dealers that when traces are done by the ATF, a higher percentage of guns recovered in crimes will show up from being sold by these dealers. And that's often used, like it is being used in this case, as evidence that these dealers are doing something nefarious, or that they're helping traffic criminal guns, when that doesn't actually provide any direct evidence that the dealer themselves has done anything wrong. In fact, oftentimes the counter argument there is these dealers tend to be in places that are just near higher crime areas or near highways or near, for instance, for Mexico, near the border. You're probably going to naturally have more Arizona or Texas or California gun dealers show up in traces of crime guns from Mexico than you are Maine licensed gun dealers, or
Montana and
Washington. Yeah, like just by the virtue of proximity, it doesn't necessarily mean that those dealers are working in concert with the cartels or illegal smugglers to send guns down there. But the implication is sort of that this is foreseeable, that this happens, and everyone knows that American-made guns end up in Mexico. And so, they're kind of using that as the basis for why Smith & Wesson should be held responsible for this. And so, no, they don't have any sort of like
smoking
hard
gun
evidence that Smith & Wesson executives are talking to the cartels or something. Right. Nothing anywhere close to something like that.
Well, I think it's worth noting, and I know this because the agency I used to work for, Immigration, Customs Enforcement, and Homeland Security Investigations, is the agency charged, along with Customs and Border Protection, with preventing guns from illegally being exported into Mexico and anywhere else for that matter, and also anything from F-16 spare parts to certain kinds of motherboards. All that stuff are their controlled items, and they can't cross the border without the government knowing about them. So there are in fact bad gun dealers. It's not like they don't exist. There's guys out there that that knowingly sell guns to straw purchasers. They knowingly sell bulk firearms and illegal firearms, all sorts of stuff. So that does go on, and those people should be absolutely prosecuted to the fullest extent of the law, in my opinion. Because here's what I know about Mexico. We digress for just a moment. So my wife's whole family is from Mexico originally. I've been there a bunch of times. Mexico, the people of Mexico are the kindest, most warm, caring, family-oriented, hardest-working people you will ever meet. Their government is a hot mess, and I mean it's a hot mess from the top to the bottom. And I can say that with some conviction and some authority. So the idea, and this is me, this is not Steven, he's a real reporter. The idea of the government of Mexico pointing the finger at anyone else for the situation in their country, other than maybe drug users, is laughable to me. Will this case go to the Supreme Court and be decided there, or is it just the Supreme Court? They're asking them, "Hey, can we just not do this?" Or what's the mechanism there like?
It'll be decided there, and the Supreme Court has a couple of options. One is just to rule that the lawsuit doesn't fit within the exceptions in the PLCAA, the Protection of Lawful Commerce in Arms Act, and just overrule the lower court in their decision on that. Or they could issue a whole opinion that kind of, obviously, or they could agree with the lower court and say this case can go forward, and the way that you've looked that Mexer does have a valid claim to make, and they'd have to then go through the process of actually having the legal argument on the merits of the claim. This stage is very early stage. This is like, because PLCAA, one of the things that it's supposed to do is stop cases before they get into the merits, to sort of short circuit them, because one of the alleged reasons that these kinds of cases were filed, especially back in the 1990s and early 2000s, right before the Congress passed the PLCAA, was that basically these were sort of meritless cases that were just designed to gum up American gun companies' time and resources and make them spend a lot of money on frivolous lawsuits, essentially. So it was the reason that Congress passed this law. That was the argument for it. And so it has a provision that says, like, you can't even get to the merit stage on these cases, that companies can use the PLCAA as a defense before you get there. So that's what we're at right now, this pre-merits argument about whether or not there's even a claim that's viable under this federal law.